Hello, it's Brad Laurie, or BlockchainBrad, and today a very special interview with John DeVadoss. He is a key member of the NEO team. In fact, he is the head of NEO Global Development, and he's in Seattle right now to really let us know exactly what NEO have been building in these last months, if not years. John, thank you very much for your time today.
Hey, Brad, thank you. Look, it's a privilege to be on this show. I do very much appreciate you giving me time. Thank you, man.
Likewise, mate. I realize that you are head of a key team in Seattle right now. It's certainly changing the game when it comes to the face of NEO in core regions of the world, especially with regard to developers and also with technology alike. Now, John, as I mentioned, you are based in Seattle. Let's discuss a bit more about what NEO has been doing. Firstly, let's start with you very quickly. You have a master's degree in computer science. You are certainly well situated to lead this out. But give us a bit of a recap on what you specifically are about and what you're doing to lead the team.
Certainly, yeah. Thank you. Thank you again for the opportunity. So yes, you're right. I do have an academic background, bachelor's in computer engineering, MS in computer science. I did do my PhD work in AI as well. Also spent many years, 16, 17 years at Microsoft. Over there, a number of things, amongst which, to highlight a few, I led the architecture strategy for the version 1 and version 2 of the .NET platform. Also built out what was called .NET patterns and practices about 10 years ago. And then most recently, I built Microsoft Digital, which was a brand new business for the company, and took it from zero to about $500 million over about 5 years. So I've been on both sides, engineering as well as business and growing a business. So also launched 2 startups after I left Microsoft. So that was before NEO. I think of myself, Brad, really as a platform guy. I mean, I've built platforms all my life. I love platforms. I know platforms. I know how developers use platforms. And so for me to join up with NEO, the foundation and NEO Global Development here in Seattle, to focus on developers and platforms was just a very natural fit, and being able to reach, what I think of as the 20+ million developers worldwide as our target, I think really sets for us a very high bar, and one we expect to get to eventually in due course.
Right. And obviously, John, I looked into your background. I'd listened to some of the interviews you'd done before. It was important that you did have that experience. That's what I look for now, especially in 2019, when we passed that 2017 speculative and hyped bubble that we saw. Now, you explained fundamentally you're about leading a team of developers in many of the conversations you've had. Can you explain a bit more about mainstream adoption in that context? How you're going to really bridge the gap, especially in light of some blockchains, particularly in the US now, who are scrapping the idea of the dApp, as many have put it, and really focusing on applications, whether they be mainstream geared and bridging with mainstream, or developing new applications for the future.
So those are some really, really good questions, Brad. I think you nailed a few issues. If perhaps I could just focus on 2. I think you called out the aspect of mainstream developers and what does it mean really? Yeah, so for me, I mean, the way, if you look at the context, the history, Brad, it very much looks as though the chains have been fighting for a very small number of developers. And the worldview was, oh, we only have these 50,000 developers that know how to build smart contracts. And so we have to figure out how to take this really small pie and share amongst the various chains. My view is completely different. The way I see it is, again, 20+ million developers. So what does it mean when I say mainstream developer? What does it really mean? It means that, these are people who write code for a living. They use well-known common tools. They have certain expectations in terms of, for example, pick debugging. As an industry, the blockchain, the crypto world has not done a good job in terms of addressing debugging scenarios. So that's a really clear, instance where, in the past, the industry has failed the mainstream developer. To give you another example, you look at the tools and the tool sets. Making or asking and demanding developers to go get the compiler from one place, to get the debugger, if available, from some other place, to get the private net from a third place, and so on. is just too many moving parts. That sets, in terms of expectations, an undue task and a tax, if you will, and certainly a pain point. So when I say mainstream developers, that we owe it to them to give them the tooling,
Mm-hmm.
one IDE, one place to go to edit, to build, debug, test, deploy, and the whole cycle.
Right.
Right, one place to go to use the libraries, the frameworks, and that's really what at Neo, we have been doing over the last 12 months in Seattle.
I see. Well,
Is to say, look,
let's pull it back, John. Just to interrupt for a second.
sure.
Let's pull it back into the concept of platform, because that's something that you really do speak about a lot in your presentations. And as you mentioned, this tool suite. Now, Neo's been building for some years now, and they've always professed to have what is to be a world-class public blockchain platform. You're talking about tooling. So in that context, SDKs, APIs, the whole suite as well. How is it going in terms of the development of the toolkit, and how ready are you to really start to showcase this in that mainstream context? I only ask you because the speed of blockchain is so rapid. The speed of this industry is even more rapid. So really, are you able to step up now and really showcase yet just how sophisticated your tool suite is in comparison to everything else that's happening?
Oh, absolutely. We are good to go right now, Brad.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, I would stake our tool sets and what we have done for developers against anybody in the industry. At this point, any mainstream developer can go to the VS Studio marketplace, download the extensions, the private net, it's all in one package, and essentially have a first-class developer experience comparable to anything they have been used to in terms of cloud platforms or other enterprise tool set. You're right.
Mm-hmm.
From a historical perspective, Neo was very unique in taking a polyglot perspective, right? Being able to address multiple languages, developers from multiple language communities. And in Seattle, what we have done is built on that very robust foundation. And obviously, bringing what we know from the team here, ensured that we can have a first-class, mainstream developer experience. To answer your question, absolutely. At this point, we are good to go. And I believe that, in terms of where the industry is, we are right at the top with respect to serving developers across the world.
Right. And John, I have to say, when I heard about your entry into Neo, when I heard that Hongfei was going to include you in that core team, I was interested and excited only because we still saw a dearth at that time of mainstream connections. The title of Microsoft has significant weight globally, as you know. You had that years of experience, decades, in fact, of experience. So what does it mean in terms of Neo's capability to bridge the mainstream with their technology beyond the dApp narrative we heard, which is a challenge in and of itself, but really showcasing what the technology can do with current businesses? That's where I'm really fascinated, because if they start to pay attention now, that should be very significant for Neo.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we could talk for a long time about this, but I would say two things, Brad. So firstly, from an engineering perspective, being able to work and partner with the best in the industry, being able to learn and obviously to work together very closely with the likes of Microsoft is a huge benefit. And as you've seen, we are the very first, and at this point, the only blockchain platform to be a member of the .NET Foundation.
Right.
So we're able to do things in terms of partnerships and business development to essentially piggyback on this, massive industry giant. And of course, to ensure that we have an experience that, again, parallels and extends what they do to serve their developers, I think is a huge, this cannot be underestimated, right? Absolutely. And this is why, by the way, Brad, we picked Seattle, as a base, because Seattle is where platforms are being built. You have Microsoft, you have Amazon Web Services, Google, and so on. And so being able to hire the best talent, but also more importantly, to partner with, to be able to jointly invest in engineering and business development is a huge advantage that I don't see, any other, big name player out there in the industry being able to do.
I totally agree. And I remember when I was tweeting about Neo and I was studying Neo some years ago, often I would make those announcements, much like what you're saying. We dig deep in the research to try and understand those connections between Neo and well-known technology businesses like Microsoft. But what I wanted to ask you now, though, John, was trying to understand some of that empirical evidence. rather than me make those suppositions, I wanted to hear from you as that head global leader. What evidence is there of those mainstream entities, you know, moving even beyond Microsoft, whereby perhaps you're going to conferences outside of the scope of the crypto sphere and really educating and enabling people to start to experiment with this technology in their own business context?
Oh, great question. Just over the last, 3-4 months, Brad, in terms of reach and awareness, being able to publish and share our architecture and design work on the Microsoft Developer Network portal, to participate in the .NET conference events. About a week and a half from now, I'll be doing a presentation at VS Live in Orlando, talking to a couple of thousand mainstream developers in the broad IT space. So, we have begun this in earnest. Right. To give you another data point, on the average, Brad, every month, there's about 7 million developers using VS Code. The fact that now we have the extensions to make Neo, building for Neo, as seamless as possible on VS Code, gives us access to those 7 million developers. And even if we can get 10% of that, Brad, over the next 12 months, 10% of that is about 4 or 5 times the total number of devs on Ethereum, right? So this is a massive step we are undertaking, and of course, we're taking the initial steps there. Just wait and watch, right? In the next 3, 6, 9 months, you will see us really piggyback, and what you might almost think of as a very captive audience that we have. That if we serve them well, we know they will take Neo to new heights, and certainly help us scale new peaks as we work to transform society and certainly our economic fabric. I don't see it as just a stack or a technology platform. I see it as the fabric for us from a socio-economic perspective, and that's why I care deeply about mainstream. If we remain in our own niche, the potential, the promise of blockchain cannot be fulfilled. We have to, and we will take it mainstream. That is the only way we can realize the full impact and the benefits of what the this movement promises.
Right, and we're seeing more and more people speak up about this right now, John, to be honest, not just CEOs, but many members of crypto, especially when we see the rinse and repeat strategies of crypto conferences, for example. You would certainly know, you've seen them happen, yes, where you get a bit of, there's a bit of a tired narrative now. It's really essential that we expand beyond this and really allow people to experience this who otherwise simply wouldn't, not just those in those speculative sort of, with those speculative mindsets, or those who are just simply trying to showcase what they're doing to people already in the know. So in that sense, I wanted to ask you, this was a big difference and a big sort of feature and value prop for Neo, and that was the .NET stack. You're an expert in that. So I wanted to better understand what exactly is it that sets Neo apart in this context when other blockchains simply aren't doing or engaging at the level of, that you are with regard to the .NET.
So again, excellent question, Brad. So I would say 2 things. Firstly, in terms of the stack itself, on the average, about 7 million developers building and deploying on the .NET platform. That is a huge, developer base for us to target and serve. Second, why do we do this? Going back in history, Neo, as Hongfei and Eric have said from the very beginning, the goal was to be the most developer-friendly blockchain. And taking a bet on .NET, Brad, in some sense, almost made this intrinsically possible, because .NET is a multi-language stack. And in doing so, we're able to much more, quickly and almost seamlessly add support for any new language, C#, Java, JavaScript, Python, Go, you name it, right? We can very rapidly integrate and add support. And not only adding support, we can also exploit the existing capabilities. So any new language we add support for, almost immediately gets access to the libraries, the tool sets. For example, we have now built out what I think is really best-in-class debugging support on the Neo blockchain toolkit for smart contract developers. Now, what we have built out can be seamlessly used for any language, right? Yes, initially we built for C#, but now you could use it for Java, for Python, Go, Eiffel, you name it, basically. So that gives us huge advantages and a time to market that I think also helps Neo be, I guess, to differentiate us from the rest of the pack. Now, why did the other chains not take a similar approach? We could speculate. I think it goes back to, I would say, a lack of awareness and a appreciation of the merits of working with mainstream developers, which I think you could say Neo, looking back in time, has from the very beginning been committed to. At the same time, I was in, like you said, events recently. I am seeing other chains, other platforms now come around and look at what we are doing and what we have done. And I think certainly it's opening a lot of people's eyes, and they're looking at, to, again, not to speak about some other chain, but I'll pick on Ethereum for lack of a better, right? I mean, the whole Truffle initiative, for example, right? Trying to build a commercial, entity to make money off developer tools, to make it elite, kind of, to close it out. At this point, clearly, it's obvious that was just a flawed strategy. And because of the contrast to what we are doing at Neo, it is so obvious it is a flawed strategy. So I think we are opening people's eyes, and I would say over the next 12 to 18 months, it is very likely you'll see other platforms follow the direction we have taken in terms of addressing mainstream developers. They have no choice.
Right, and we're actually, excuse me, we're actually seeing that with the likes of Matt Spoke and Aon, for example, with their change in pace with regard to the open application network. Not to obviously shill or FOMO, that's not my goal in any sense. Certainly, as you know, this is a free interview entirely, but really it's about starting to listen to some of the CEOs and some of the head developers discuss the imperatives of enabling a greater increase in influx in developers so that you can start to really be about utility. That's really got to be the future of all of these ecosystems, not just this speculative frame we've seen in the past. So I wanted to ask you, in the context of Neo, is there, since you've onboarded or you've become part of the team, have you noticed a shift in more of a dev-centric, more of a technology-centric approach, rather than what initially seemed to happen was, yes, there was some core technological assets, but the hype train was very strong, not just with Neo, with every digital platform or every blockchain platform we saw a lot of conferences, we saw a lot of discussion, we saw Hongfei on stage everywhere. But it does seem that in the last year, the team is very focused, very quiet, not necessarily out there on stage, even with Hongfei as well. So was there a shift in the plan at some stage?
No, not really, Brad. I mean, I would say, if you look back in time, you look at the DBFT innovation, the pioneering work that Eric did, the architectural and the underpinnings of Neo, the polyglot bet that was made, 4 years ago, to ensure that we could target and serve developers from any language, any community. I would say the underlying, ambition, the vision of being the most developer-friendly chain has not changed. Now, your point about the hype cycle is fair. I think it's a very valid point. From my perspective, I would say the hype train is not something we have the ability to control or manage. Right. Demand obviously from the marketplace, and like you said, events. The number of events was certainly much higher about 2 years ago, possibly than today. And so there is demand, and supply, will match the demand. So I would say, in some sense, it was just a facet of the environment, of the macro environment, and less about Neo per se. We've always been, very steadfast about the ambition, the goal. We are a platform, Brad. Yes, we happen to be obviously many things as well, but at the core, we are a platform. And the bet is a long-term bet to build the most, the most developer-friendly platform for the smart economy, and that will not change, for the foreseeable future.
Sure, and it makes a lot of sense. Obviously, it's a really important point you're making, that you're here for the long term, as is Neo, and as am I. Otherwise, what are we doing in this space if it's really just about that short-term blockchain bet? Now, with regard to some of those key statements as well, John, we talk about the demand economy, and often that's used, to really put forward the overall value. But for those like you, it means a lot more than that. What does it mean in terms of the context of disruption, in the context of applications, and most importantly, in the context of tokenized assets for the future that can be part of the broadening, growing ecosystem of Neo?
Fantastic question. For us, very simply, Brad, it means digitizing any and all assets. This is a train that is gathering speed, gathering momentum. We will see asset digitization across all shapes, sizes, and forms. And we are betting that across, the core platform, the stack, with Neo ID, Neo IFS, the Oracle support, the tooling support, that we will be in the best place to be able to support this asset digitization. That is
Mm-hmm.
the disruptive element. To do so, again, we have to make this drop dead simple. For example, with the Neo toolkit right now, in about 3-4 minutes, Brad, you can build and deploy a simple smart contract.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the nature of the expectation we are driving and fulfilling, to realize this ambition of the smart economy. Digitize any and all assets. This is a train, like I said, it's gathering speed, gathering momentum.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when and how quickly, it's hard to predict the future. But I would say in the next, 2.5, 3 years, we're going to see a massive shift with respect to tokenization and asset digitization.
Mm-hmm.
And we are there, right there, waiting for this in a huge momentum shift.
Right. And John, I wanted to ask you, and I hope you don't mind me being direct about this, but in the past, there's been a lot of suggestions, or there's been some at the very least, either from those who've been CEOs of applications that have onboarded with Neo, or those just in the wider crypto space. They've criticized Neo for, at different times about whether or not there was the efficiency, there was the productivity, there was the scalability, especially when it came to those experimenting being applications on Neo. Now, I ask you this because you're certainly cognizant of all the development. That tool suite development is absolutely fundamental in terms of really developing what you're planning to do. That's really the secret sauce, is all of these suite of technologies and products and services. So do you feel that there was any criticism that was fair in the past that has now been utilized by the Neo team to upgrade, to develop, to tweak, to improve, so that you can, make that valid claim that you will be in the front position, or that pole position in the future as a leading blockchain platform?
Absolutely. I mean, like I said, Brad, I'm a platform guy. I've built, all my professional life platforms. And to build platforms, feedback from the developer community is the lifeblood. That
Mm-hmm.
feedback is what you listen, you take in. It helps you to prioritize what to build. Now, I certainly, cannot and do not want to look back in time, but I would say at this point in time, the developer experience for Neo is
Mm-hmm.
best in class. And you're going to see again in the coming weeks and months, right? I would stake our developer experience against anybody at this point in the industry.
It's a
Furthermore,
big statement, John, and I appreciate that. I mean, especially coming from you, because it'll all come down to proof in the end. So how much empirical proof is there with regard to GitHub access, the repos, or even just, conversations from developers? Now, how much information can we access with regard to verification of this, suite of value, all the tool suite?
yeah, I mean, it's very simple. I would just say to anybody out there, go to the VS Code Marketplace, go to, neo.org/dev, download and work with the tool set and tell me, what else can you go build a fairly simple smart contract in about 3 or 4 minutes and go through the entire life cycle.
Mm-hmm.
Edit, debug, build, deploy to private, to public, all the way back and forth and full circle. Just the debugging, support alone, Brad, I would say puts Neo in a very unique place in the industry with respect to helping developers to be productive. Now, with that said, we also have Neo 3 coming up very shortly. In the next 3, 4, 5 months, you'll see Neo 3 out in the market. That's a massive investment we have made in terms of the core infrastructure with respect to, obviously, performance, i.e. latency and scalability,
Mm-hmm.
with the goal of taking Neo mainstream. You're going to see that as a significant step in terms of taking Neo to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
Between Neo 3 and the investments and the work we have done and will do on the tooling side, I think you're going to see a massive shift in the market. One thing, Brad, early on, I think you made a very good point about dApps and just apps in the mainstream. I think you really hit something there with your very precise observation. The term dApp, I think, unfortunately, is baggage we are carrying as an industry. If I could, I would just drop the term dApp.
Right.
So why is this? I think, first of all, we will not see pure pristine dApps. There will always be hybrid dApps. There will always be hybrid apps, right? To be able to digitize assets means that you have one foot in the old and one foot in the new. So when we say dApp, I think we are somewhat, unfairly setting up this positioning. Second,
Mm-hmm.
there's almost this search for this mythical unicorn dApp that will drive adoption and change the industry. In the history of platforms, Brad, that has never been the case.
Right.
The way it works is, you empower millions of developers, and 1,000 flowers will bloom. And across those, you will see innovation, growth, and obviously rapid adoption. So on those two fronts, I think you're spot on. If we could just maybe retire the phrase dApp and instead focus on apps, and certainly apps thematically, for example, for the smart economy,
Mm-hmm.
I think we'd be better off with respect to engaging and bridging to the mainstream developer community out there.
I totally agree with you there. And certainly as we see things play out for the next year, there's more evidence to suggest that that's the way things are going. Now, for that to happen, John, we need to see users, especially those who don't necessarily need to have a deep understanding of blockchain, but certainly they have the desire to work seamlessly with a technology like you to really do what they want to do, which is build an application.
Right.
Now, how are things going with regard to the application front in terms of number, in terms of growth? Because that's going to be essential for those who are supporting NEO, whether that's from the speculative sort of agenda, or whether that's from a developer agenda, or whether that's from just the wider proponents of crypto. All of us want to know that developers are increasing, applications are increasing, and that this is an ever-expanding ecosystem.
Well, absolutely. Again, a fantastic question. So having spent almost 25 years building and working on platforms, Brad, there are two things the developers want. One is, the tooling and the developer experience to be able to build first-class applications. The second thing they want is distribution, being able to distribute the apps they build to as many users as possible. So we have a very clear strategy. The first is obviously the bet on developers, building, again, the most developer-friendly stack in the industry. The second thing, you might recollect at Consensus New York a few months ago, we announced EcoBoost.
Yes.
EcoBoost is a ring-fenced fund of almost $100 million, probably, outpaces and outspends any other chain by about 10 or 20 times. Between the focus on tooling and the developer experience and EcoBoost to incent to drive distribution, I think we are very uniquely positioned to really draw not just developers, but also to draw users and usage. And of course, you'll see the fruits of this coming in the next 6 to 9 months, especially as we launch Neo 3 and the window of time shortly thereafter. So for us, the next 12 plus months, totally fascinating.
Right, and
it's going to be.
And EcoBoost itself was a huge boon for NEO, clearly because it was a fun setup to really encourage developers to really build out the prosperity of NEO. But I wanted to ask you a few things about that. Now, firstly, you mentioned Web3, the Neo 3 that's coming. In the context of EcoBoost, they are very synergized. What is more of that empirical evidence to suggest, the plan? I want to really understand what these terms mean when it comes to Neo 3, because you've mentioned in many interviews before things like storage improvements, oracles, just general tooling. There's even the Neo VM, lots are being done, with Eric and the team technologically. But what does it mean for enterprise? What does it mean for the growth of Neo specifically, if we can just focus on the relationship between Neo 3 and EcoBoost?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're right. First of all, I think you said very well. Eric and the team have done fantastic work in terms of the core protocols, with respect to the VM itself, decoupling the VM from the chain, for example, to give you one instance. The architectural work in terms of storage, the intrinsic Oracle support, all with one singular goal in mind, Brad. It's about enabling mainstream adoption. Now, you said the word enterprise. I wouldn't say necessarily the word enterprise. I would say commercial.
Okay.
I think for me, commercial spans, both the consumer world and the business world, right? Because we are looking at it broadly as a smart economy theme that spans consumer world and the commercial world. And that's how I would like to think in terms of scenarios. And with that said, EcoBoost for me is the icing on the cake. Like I said, there are two things developers want: tools, the dev experience, and then distribution. On both fronts, we're going to hit this out of the park. The numbers, you'll see us announce obviously over the coming months. In fact, EcoBoost was just launched, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, something like that. You'll see us share the numbers. The next DevCon, the next Neo DevCon, early next year, will be a milestone event where you'll see us share a lot more in terms of the startups, the early stage investments we have made, as well as the adoption numbers. And I'm hopeful that once we can retire this word dApp and instead focus on apps, and certainly apps for the smart economy, you will see us be able to disclose a lot more detail with respect to the impact of the investments, NGD Seattle, EcoBoost, NGD Shanghai, in terms of the co-architecture work and so on and so forth.
It's certainly exciting, and you've always talked about the commoditization of blockchain in the sense that, like you said, e-commerce is one key vertical that perhaps is the burgeoning region. And in that context, we see DeFi as a very significant narrative. Often it's sort of juxtaposed with Ethereum quite today. But is it fair to say that DeFi is a shared narrative? It's something that is relatively agnostic and something that Neo also is a proponent of?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, if you look at, for example, the work being done on Neo, you look at the Nash exchange up in Europe. That was an offshoot of the early City of Zion work. Very innovative, pioneering work done by the guys over there. If you look at the work that in terms of custodies and custodians, all the way in between, the stable coin support. So you're spot on. DeFi is a shared narrative, if we could use that phrase. It is a cross-industry, cross-chain. And from my perspective, we haven't seen the best yet. This is still so early in terms of what we are seeing, the innovation. Even this is so profoundly disruptive to the existing mainstream players. But in my opinion, we haven't seen anything yet. The next 12 to 18 months in terms of disruptive innovation for the consumer, especially as we see the mainstream systems creaking and breaking down with the stresses they have self-imposed on themselves. And by this, I mean, the central banking authorities, and certainly the way much of the Western world, we have driven, our economic, both fiscal as well as monetary policies. I think there is a very clear opening and a very clear opportunity. And the millennials have the expectation, that we serve them, we provide them with these capabilities. And for me, this is just the beginning, Brad. I mean, there is so much more coming, man.
I totally agree. And we're facing now a triad challenge, as many call it, with the corporates, with the governments, and also with the people. And often they are separate, but in many respects, and Hongfei has always said this, his intention is not to separate those three powers, but just find better solutions for new for the millennials, for us, as all of us as participants in new industries, to try and provide new not platforms and narratives for the future, especially when it comes to financial change. Now, in that sense, we see China doing this. I definitely wanted to ask you about the connections between the pro-blockchain stance that China's taking, and they have done so for years. It's nothing new, and Neo. I've always asked Hongfei this. We've always had these very, very loose discussions because he could never really tell me too much, especially at the time when we'd speak. But really now that blockchain is at the, on the tips of the tongues of many of the different economists in China, for example, many of the different reporters, and even in the government now, they're very pro-blockchain. Is that going to impact Neo specifically? Because we do see, based on the lists that have come forward, that certain public blockchains are going to be advantaged by these pro-blockchain moves in China.
So first of all, I think it is of huge value to the entire blockchain industry. And certainly anybody who's a player or an entity or a developer working on blockchain. So I see it as a plus for everybody. I mean, this is a rising tide that will raise all boats. Now, will it certainly benefit us? Obviously, yes. I mean, us and any other players who have an interest in a global market, we see Neo as a global platform. And from that perspective, yes, absolutely. We will benefit, and we want to add and create value in return, to the value we derive. So for us, for Ethereum, for you name it, across the board, across the spectrum, I think there is. And by the way, one more thing, Brad, I think this is just the beginning. I think you're going to see, other geographies, other nations, other countries also be much more forthcoming very shortly to declare their priorities. Obviously, people are not going to sit still and wait. Now that the gauntlet has been thrown,
Mm.
I foresee, across the Western and the Eastern hemisphere, more and more countries now stepping up and being much more vocal about the support and the priority of
Mhm.
blockchain capabilities, Brad.
Right, I totally agree. And we also see now suggestions of the Chinese government taking a very asset-based approach, looking at the blockchain and how that can advantage their centralized position and even their position as a world power. Does that concern you at all, given that the core value proposition of NEO has always been about distribution? It's always been about, really providing for a new means of technology that capitalized on this idea of decentralization, first and foremost. Are there any inherent risks you see? And the reason I ask this is because NEO is a global platform. There is no question of that. We know that for
Correct.
sure. But
Correct.
there is also the truth that it started initially, with strong connections with various players in China, whether they be private entities, corporations, or whether they be, in fact, some government connections to, build that support. So there is some special relationships that NEO does have with China, certainly. But the question is, what does it mean in the context of the broader blockchain landscape for NEO? And could it actually be a great advantage for them as a global platform to have also those core relationships that they've forged early on? That's what I'm really trying to understand.
Yes, I mean, it's an ecosystem. I mean, the way I see it is it's an ecosystem. We're all building this together. So whether it be, China or a Libra in the US, or more recently, I think earlier this week, we saw the discussion in the news in the European Union about a possible euro coin, right? So I think now, the horse, how do they say it, has left the
The
barn,
gate,
if you will,
right?
right? So exactly, right? And there's no way to put it back in. The genie's out of the bottle. So I don't think, I think for the first time now we are seeing it mainstream. Libra was a very big surprise, and certainly it helped drive the word blockchain to the mainstream world. And now obviously with the China announcements and the EU announcements, I think this is all absolutely goodness. This is the right thing, at the right time. And for us, yes, we will work with the policymakers in any geography across, any country, any nation. Our goal, like I said, with the smart economy is to digitize assets. And we can only do so with a good policy and governance environment, which means working with the policymakers. And in fact, even in the Seattle area locally here, we're very, very active with the blockchain councils, the forums. There is what's called the Cascadia Blockchain Council, which spans the Northwest and Canada as well. I'm a member, so we've been very active, very forthcoming to engage, to obviously work with the policymakers and the policy they set. So for me, this is all goodness. I mean, I don't see anything with respect to all three continents, the announcements and the press. I think it's very good to have the visibility.
Right.
I think it's very good to have the momentum, and certainly attracts, for me, it attracts more mainstream developers into the space. There is more curiosity. There is certainly more interest, and it's doing good marketing for me, Brad.
Yes, absolutely. And we also see in the US now increasing clarifications of various assets, whether they're commodities, whether they're currencies, or whether they're utilities. We're seeing much more focus and more attention on this complexity. And that's only going to get clearer in time, because that's typically always been the process. This technology starts first, and then the compliance and the regulation follows suit. Now, I want to ask you though, with regard to private blockchains in the narrative we hear, we've already seen evidence of the adoption of certain private chains in the context of commerce. We've seen that can advantage productivity. Now, with regard to tokenized models, that tokenized economy, the smart economy that's emerging, have you heard of any of the suggestions of a declining interest in that side of things from sectors that are used to private blockchains, for example, used to their own closed databases for a means of technology?
So it's a very good question again, Brad. I mean, I'll give you some history. When I was part of building out the very first wave of the Microsoft Azure, the cloud stack for Microsoft, there was a similar trend. We would hear from people about, look, I don't want to use the public cloud. I want a private cloud.
Right.
I want to build my own private cloud instance, right? And over time, it became apparent that, yes, there was a need in certain markets, in certain sectors, but that was not going to be the majority, if you will, with respect to usage. I see the same thing happening here, Brad. There will always be, some small subset, and whether it's for economic reasons or security reasons or, other they might have, certainly, we will meet the demand of the market. With
Mhm.
that said, I certainly believe the vast majority, the mainstream, will certainly be on some combination of public and possibly, some permission chains. Now, of course, in this context, it is too soon, I think, to call winners and losers. The scenario, the movie, to me plays out much like the cloud movie. Again, back then we had the so-called hybrid cloud scenario.
Mhm.
I see a similar trend here as well, where it might not be in isolation. Maybe the settlement will happen on the public chain, and we may have, within the permission private chain, more of a focus on consortia or other private, transactional systems in place. But certainly, that's also a very, very viable possibility.
Mhm.
And of course, the mix all the way through. With that said, I certainly do believe that public is the significant majority with respect to adoption, traction, and certainly commercial usage in the near future.
Mhm.
And we'll see a smaller subset of the permission private for sure.
Well, it's good to hear that from you, obviously, because you represent a very significant public platform now, or the public technology as well, with it being open source for the people, as a platform to really enable developers to start to interact with something that is essentially really trying to change the game. Now,
Hmm.
with the likes of Ethereum also right there, I did want to ask you something, again, direct. Some supporters of Ethereum, for example, are now suggesting that the core technological asset or the token itself is money. Now, we see the likes of Bitcoin in a very different light. Obviously, it's always been geared from the outset to be a peer-to-peer. Essentially, it was meant to be a cash initially, but now we're seeing it emerge as an SOV for today. So in the light of Ethereum, which in many respects reflects the goals and ethos of Neo, with the starting point of smart contracts, what are your thoughts when people say ETH is money, especially in the context of Neo with its tokenized asset?
So, and I don't mean to be flippant, and I'll just tell you sort of my summary answer,
Mm.
and I'll give you more details. I think money is in the eye of the beholder, and how people want to perceive it, as a store of value, as a unit of account, as a unit of exchange. I mean, I think it's up to the customer. The customer, the user is king, queen, and jack, and they will dictate to us how they perceive and how they see real value, deriving from the usage of whether it be Neo or Bitcoin or something else altogether. I
Mm.
don't think it's for the platform developers to dictate or define these terms. I would say, you tell us how you use it, and obviously we will work within the framework of your models.
Mm.
Also, with that said, I think today's terminology is still somewhat primitive, Brad. This view that it has to be one of the three, SOV, U of A, or medium of exchange. I think it's somewhat constraining. I don't think. Look, I mean, 10 years ago, this notion of fiat currency having competition was an alien concept, right? 10 years or
Right.
12 years ago. Who would have thought?
Sure.
Today, it's mainstream. And so I think, we are still discovering how to think and how to articulate and how to discuss and debate this. I would say, using some of these phrases perhaps is just constraining innovation and maybe, dictating how to think and talk, when I think open it up.
Right. It's a
Money
really
is in the eye
interesting
of the
point you
beholder.
raise. It's a fascinating point you raise, because you're really suggesting that the concept of money itself is somewhat plastic, in that it's really sits in a continuum. Often we hear the narrative of then the necessitates or the forms of money that need to exist for it to be that. But I do tend to agree. I think that we're now starting to change the discussion of what constitutes certain
Yeah.
value propositions and what assets, and the question of whether or not something can be solely and wholly a store of value and therefore have its own unique value proposition for those who so wish to engage in that asset. It's the same in the context of Neo, though. So I do want to talk to you about that, because obviously there are legal reasons and there's terminological reasons why we need to better articulate what Neo is as an asset. But what you're suggesting is A, it's nascent, B, you're evolving and you're building. But when it comes to the utility token itself, which we know is the term now used, do you still stand true to that notion of utility? That being the core driver of the asset itself, that obviously for people are using for various reasons. But as I've always said, when people first bought NEO, they did not buy it as a utility, they bought it as a pre-utility, with the prospect of belief that this would evolve into a strong, significant and valuable asset that would represent something bigger. And that was the ecosystem that you continue to build. So do you still stand true that this is a valid utility?
Again, a very good question. I'm going to give you a slightly nuanced response, Brad. And this comes to me, from my own conviction. I believe the term utility token was conceived a few years ago by people who were trying to work within certain frameworks and models as defined by certain policy organizations.
Right.
And I tend to actually take a significantly different perspective. I think this was done by some early movers to try to meet certain obligations. I would not want to put myself in a box by calling something an A token or a B token or a utility token. I think this space is so rapidly, evolving that anything I say to you today, in about 6 months or even 3 months, may be up for debate. I would probably focus more on the platform side and say, look, we are building the most dev-friendly platform in the world.
I see.
We are building the platform to digitize assets, and we will see. Look, much of the central banking and even the policymakers are still trying to catch up to figure out what's going on. And I think they owe it to us. They owe it to us across the various geographies to give us some very clear and precise guidelines. And what I'm seeing today is it's still somewhat primitive. And to be fair, it's early and they are learning or trying to figure out what's going on.
Right.
But I think for me, these buckets of, for example, the term utility token, I think was a self-serving notion that was put together by the early Ethereum guys, that I would not want to put myself in a box.
It's an absolutely fascinating response. I've never had anyone explain it like that. And I tend to agree that it was, in many respects, a means of grappling with what was emerging technologically. Now, let's talk about something that often people don't want to, and that is speculation. That is the current scenario of people making crypto bets or blockchain bets in a crypto casino, because that happens. And many very savvy supporters of blockchain and of the crypto space more generally are suggesting that there is a large majority of, for want of a better term, crypto crap. I won't throw out specific percentages, but a lot of people are suggesting that much of which is speculated on is done so more for short-term gains, relying on media hype and the like. So in this, reasonable sort of suggestion of questionable conduct and the highly volatile market that we see, the token itself tends to go on its own journey. It tends to be something that moves in accordance with the speculation. Is it something that has bothered NEO? Because we certainly have seen people shift out of NEO based on price, which is a huge concern for those who are long on blockchain, for those who are really here for the long term and what not just NEO but the broader system of blockchain can do. And does it concern you about the rise speculation that's ubiquitous?
So very, very insightful question, Brad. I would profess not to speak for the foundation here. Let me speak for myself, just to be clear.
Sure.
First of all, if you look at the .com boom or even the early cloud boom, there has always been speculation. Speculation is inherent, intrinsic. Second, just to give you an example, I'm sure you're very familiar with the WeWork saga recently,
right?
And what
Yes.
happened to WeWork, right? And I'll tell you, look, that is that is nothing comparable to what we are seeing with respect to the blockchain platforms and the crypto world. This is speculation at such a global mammoth scale, right? And the common investor was so close to being screwed until obviously, whatever happened to WeWork. So I would say this is the nature of the game. I think the nature of economics is such that it attracts investors, speculators, traders. And that's basically how capitalism works. This is the free market. And so I say, look, the more the merrier. So we welcome them all. But it's not for me, and certainly I cannot speak for the foundation to pass judgment with respect to speculation. I think it's we are human, and certainly we trade, we speculate, and we exchange. Now, what percent of each happens, we can debate. But I can tell you one thing: as we become more mainstream, I think you will see the pendulum sort of converge with respect to a focus on creating value and capturing value, and less with respect to speculation. Now, of course, how long it will take us to get there, obviously, your guess, and you're a very smart man, you know the space very well, is as good as mine.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because the speed of I guess the speed of crypto more generally is all dependent on price, essentially, because that really attracts a lot of people to the space. But when we're talking about the evolution of technology, that's somewhat, of a long position. That's going to take more time. But one thing we do see, though, John, is that as price has been often a dictator of attention, for the most part, many people who are participants in this space have a short-term attention span. If the price is that volatile that there's such flux that it declines in value after ascending substantially, like we saw the likes of Neo, Icon, etc., in that first wave, or perhaps subsequent to Bitcoin, which is really the first mover. So really, what I'm getting at here is very fundamental and very complex, no doubt, and that is token economic modeling. That token modeling that really allows for a synergy between eco value, or more importantly, a smart economy platform's value, and the representation of that as the fuel. We have not seen that evidence right across the board, and I think that's fair to say. And that's because of that very powerful aspect of speculation that's really a ubiquitous feature of crypto. It's always there to challenge the question of what is the real value of these fuel tokens, these things that are really incentivizing developers and incentivizing the network and driving the future. So you raise a really interesting point, because you're suggesting that we're moving towards a position where it's more dev centric. It's more about the core
platform centric, more about creating and capturing value. I would say one more thing, and again, just in the spirit of debate and discussion, if I could push back, right? I mean, you look at, for example, the so-called mainstream, and over the last 8, 9, 10 years, right? Zero and negative interest rates, Brad. Trillions and trillions of dollars and euros of debt have signicantly inflated asset prices.
Absolutely.
So do the asset prices in the so-called mainstream markets reflect reality? I mean, you clearly know where it is, right? It is not.
You raised such a good point there, John, because when we're talking about fiat, we know that it's, I guess, an airless money. I mean, it's backed by air. It's backed by nothing. And so in that respect, whenever the powers that be need to print more, they do so. And that's, just the system that exists. So you really raise a good point. But in that context, John, we're talking typically about securities. I think that's a fair point. So in the interest of, the future, we're not talking about securities. We're talking about new asset classes that don't even exist. And I agree with you. I think that trying to reduce things down into these finite ideas of utility token, perhaps where it's still so nascent, we don't know exactly how to distinguish them. But my question more so is so important about correlations of value, because one of the things that I guess a lot of the people who want to be here for the years that come, to come in terms of supporting blockchain, like myself, we want to make sure that that token, regardless of its nomenclature, actually can correlate with growth. Do you understand what I mean? Because otherwise it makes us question what is the actual function of that token.
Very true. And I think you nailed it. I mean, absolutely, right? I mean, it goes back to, again, the ambition and certainly the long-term strategy of what is the underlying rationale for the existence of this particular platform and stack and so on. For us, it's very clear, long-term, right? I mean, this is about enabling, as we see, Hongfei's vision of the smart economy. It's very clear. It's a singular vision. And everything we build, everything we invest, everything, we sort of accumulate as part of the tool set, the ecosystem, is about fulfilling that vision. Now, what happens with respect to, value, as we know, again, from the so-called mainstream markets, value fluctuates. The perception of value fluctuates as well. At the same time, if you look at, again, to use another term that has been much perhaps abused, the so-called fundamentals. So I would encourage people to look at the fundamentals, if you will. What is the long-term strategy? What are the metrics? What are the goals? What is the investment going? Where is the focus? And they make their own choice with respect to, is this a platform play, or is it a
I
play to
totally agree
obviously
with
much,
you.
right?
If we don't do that due diligence for ourselves, we are then, beholden to a very risky sort of play, and it really does start to enter into that casino agenda if we don't go and
True.
have qualified, assessments of what we deem as value of the long term. I guess, we're going to see things play out in the future, but I did want to ask you with regard to the fragility of crypto more generally, when we look at exchanges and we look at the concerns of how finance is backed or how assets are backed. If we look at with Tether, for example, without wanting to name names specifically, and I won't, there's no question that there is a degree of fragility right now, or there's questions of that. Does it concern you at all, given that liquidity is an imperative for, part of the imperative of the success of crypto, of Neo? I mean, you do need to have that to drive, success forward, and that should also be a consequence of the broadening and growing developer ecosystem. But more to the point, does the current scenario of liquidity and the fragility that's being reported concern you in any way?
Not at all. Not at all. I think
Okay.
what you sometimes hear and see in some of the so-called mainstream media sometimes can be misleading.
Okay.
So to the question, not at all. Absolutely not at all. For us, it's very clear.
Right. I'm glad that's crystal clear. Now, what about runway? We know the NGD is part of the overall sort of map that you created and the different part components. Do you have a significant runway? EcoBoost would indicate this, that you are certainly positioned to build out the infrastructure to increase your team.
Oh, absolutely. It's crystal clear. I mean, in fact, the numbers, we've been very transparent and very public about sharing these numbers, or on a regular basis. And again, you nailed it, Brad. I mean, the fact that we can make an investment like EcoBoost, which is at least 10, maybe 20 times larger than any other comparable chain, I think is a testament to obviously the resources that we have, and that we are willing to bet to ensure the longevity and the value of the Neo platform.
I see. Well, John, I'm willing to bet that you have partnerships up your sleeves you're not telling us as well. Given that you've been relatively quiet as a team comparatively to others that are very vocal, some we see, in part of the sort of crypto hype bubble, we see them announcing announcements constantly to really try and create a bit of attention, which is understandable if there is validity in that announcement. But you haven't taken that tact with Neo in the last, year, I would argue. So partnerships wise, announcement wise, movement wise, can we expect some big things to really come through once, they're guaranteed, once that they're certified?
Oh, absolutely. Certainly. I mean, two things that I would say, Brad. One, yes, they have been and certainly continue to be in progress. We tend to take the view that shipping speaks for itself. And so shipping tool sets and toolkits and bits, we think is much more mature with respect to landing our story in the market. And secondly, as we discussed earlier, with Neo 3 and the upcoming DevCon next year, you'll see an entire slew of these announcements and these big deals that obviously we are making and certainly executing on. But personally, for me, shipping bits, shipping tools, I think that's the most effective way you can tell the story and say, look for yourself, right? I mean, a press release is only a press release, but something you can download and use to build, to actually create value, to capture value. I mean, it doesn't get better than that.
Totally agree. Right now, John, what are the numbers like of the applications, and from the assessment and the analysis from the team, where are the regions in the world where the Neo platform is being utilized, or more importantly, the tool suite is being utilized most?
It's global. I mean, just to give you an example, Brad. I mean, if you look at, for example, the core developers in NEO, right? I mean, the core developers come obviously from Shanghai, but they come from Latin America, they come from Brazil, Argentina,
Mhm.
they come from the US, they come from Western Europe, from Spain, Portugal, Italy, the UK, Switzerland. You know, they come from Russia. They, you know, so it's a global ecosystem that NEO has the privilege of working with and supporting. Secondly, the downloads themselves, we're seeing it, you know, span the globe. In about a week and a half, you know, we will have a beta of the Neo blockchain toolkit. We're going to push even more in terms of awareness, in terms of adoption. Ask me the numbers again in about 6 months, and I can give you very precise breakdowns of geography, country, sector, and possibly even by industry as well at that time.
Right. Well, clearly there's a lot happening, and I tweeted about this recently. You very rarely see Hongfei, engage in of late anyway on on stages of significant sort of conferences, for example. But he is starting to emerge. I'm starting to see his face again, and that I've always suggested, starts to indicate that NEO are really starting to come out, and let people know of this next phase of development. Is that a fair remark to make?
Oh, I mean, I think it's always, look, I'm a big fan of Hongfei. I mean, he's a very charismatic leader and speaker. So always good to see him on stage. But he has been very active. I mean, I would say, in fact, this week he's in Singapore. You probably saw a bunch of announcements and certainly a lot of press. He's very active on the stage. So we do, a number of these events. I was in Malta just about a month ago. We were there for the Delta Summit in Malta, and we had our sessions. But like you said, always good to see Hongfei on stage and talk about NEO. I think that is a very infectious passion that we could all use from.
Absolutely. And, as long as there's integrity and quality in the tech, he can talk as much as he likes. And that's what does matter to all of the people that want to see, again, blockchain survive and thrive in the future. We've talked so much. We discussed, a very vast array, right from the technological integrity to the social value to the plans that you have. Competition-wise, if we could just touch on that, we see now layer one solutions coming forth. Just a few names, to support that. Companies like Solana, Nia, Polkadot, Holochain, as I mentioned, Aon and their OAN plan. Icon, was very much the buzzword years ago. So, do any of these layer one solutions or platform solutions do they concern you at all? When we hear sometimes people suggesting that only a few are going to make it.
So I have a different view, Brad. I mean, I think that it is, first of all, it is too soon, too early to call winners and losers. We haven't seen the best yet. Secondly, this will not be a single chain world. There will be multiple chains. There will be multiple winners, that emerge out of this one. And number three, the big chains do not really scare us, or certainly do not scare me. For example, you look at Ethereum, right? I mean, at this point, this shift to sharding, Brad, this is a non-trivial shift. It could break essentially every existing smart contract on Ethereum. Just think about that. And that is the kind of change that could break and make platforms. So again, to my first point, too early, and certainly not the right time for us to worry about one or the other. I mean, in fact, I want us to pull together. I think we can learn and benefit from each other. But in about 2-3 years, you will see kind of the winners emerge, and you will see a few fall on the wayside. But even then, it will be a polychain world, right? There will be multiple chains by sector, geography, by industry possibly, and so on and so forth. So for us, for me, certainly the more the merrier. But I think many of the existing players certainly have huge issues of their own that will come to the fore very shortly, and they'll have to figure out how to deal with it.
It sounds like that's also something you've done as a team. You've grappled with some of those concerns you mentioned, how much time the team spent on debugging smart contracts themselves, and being one of the leading smart contracts, that was really important to hear that the team was focused on those aspects. Clearly now, John, you're coming out of the blocks really for that next phase. And this is not one of a few that are very significant. This is just an ever evolving, process of phases of release of information. And as you mentioned, this is just the beginning, I think, for NEO. I always said right from the outset, those that are taking that, the broader position of the smart contract solution and then building upon that, I think they're the ones that are going to have a significant stake in the future of this industry. You're starting to suggest more and more so that there's evidence through the tool suites and the increasing, developer interest that that's all coming. So, John, I wish you all the very best, as lead developer or as head global developer for NEO. for everything that's coming. And I hope we can catch up again to discuss more of the specifics in the future of perhaps, looking at key numbers when it comes to applications, really exploring and having a chat with devs, for example. But right now, there's a lot going on in terms of this next phase of NIA's development.
Very true, bro. Very true. And again, look, I want to thank you. Thank you for giving me time. Thank you for giving me the focus on your program. Really enjoyed talking with you. Really appreciate the insightful questions. And yeah, let's stay connected, and we'll share with you more as we learn, and with the numbers themselves. But again, really want to thank you. You've really put some thought into the questions, and I really enjoyed the discussion, Brad. So thank you again.
You're very welcome, mate. And make sure also you say g'day from me to Hongfei, and also tell him I'm looking forward to an interview with him. He knows that. And certainly I'll try and make an effort to catch up with him in sometime in the future. But all the best and keep building.
Likewise. Good day, Brad. Take care, man. Bye-bye.
See you, mate.